There is a structure beside the M6 that drivers have passed for decades without ever quite deciding to look at. The brain files it automatically, the same reflex that registers an overpass or a cooling tower and moves on. Something large, something red, something that has been there long enough to have become simply part of the architecture of that stretch of motorway, permanent in the way that things become permanent when they outlast the attention of the people who see them every day. Pull your eyes off the road for a moment and the building resolves into something more deliberate than the brain's quick processing suggests. The elevation is long, very long, a horizontal run of brick that extends far enough to register as architectural intention rather than accident. There are 7 floors. There is a tower. The proportions communicate at motorway speed, the same thing they communicated when the building was new, that whatever was happening inside it was serious, was substantial, was worth the trouble of constructing something on this scale. The name on the building says Fort Dunlop. It has always said Fort Dunlop. This, at least, has not changed. What the name no longer says, what the building can no longer say with any honesty, is what Fort Dunlop actually was. Stand inside the managed office suites on a Tuesday afternoon, and the distance between sign and reality is considerable. Marketing agencies occupy floors that once vibrated with the mechanical rhythm of industrial production. Consultants take calls in spaces where the air once carried carbon black fine enough to settle on every surface and into every fold of skin. The Wi-Fi is excellent. The coffee is artisan. There is parking, and the parking is described in the property literature as one of the amenities. This is Fort Dunlop now, a preserved shell, commercially successful, architecturally intact, and entirely emptied of the activity that built it. To understand how a place like this becomes what it is now, you have to understand what it once was. Not in the abstract, not as industrial heritage, but in the specific and physical sense of what it felt and smelled and sounded like to stand inside a facility employing 10,000 people on a site that never, at its height, fully stopped. You have to go back past the hotel extension and the managed suites and the regeneration project that cost £45 million and saved the building while quietly burying the memory of what the building was for. You have to go back to the beginning. The beginning, as so many British industrial stories do, starts somewhere else entirely, with something small, with an ordinary domestic frustration transformed by a practical mind into something that would reshape the world. In a yard in Belfast in 1888, a Scottish-born veterinary surgeon named John Boyd Dunlop fitted an air-filled rubber tube to the wheels of his son's tricycle. The boy had been complaining. The solid rubber wheels transmitted every cobblestone directly through the frame, and Belfast had a great many cobblestones. Dunlop was not an engineer in any formal sense. He was a man with a problem to solve and the temperament to solve it. He wrapped the wheels in rubber, inflated the tube, and sent the boy out into the street. The result was immediate and obvious. The cushion of compressed air absorbed what the road threw at it. The ride was transformed. Dunlop applied for a patent in the same year. He was not, as it turned out, the first to have arrived at this idea. A Scottish engineer named Robert William Thomson had secured a broadly similar patent back in 1845, more than 4 decades earlier. Thomson's version had never found its moment. The market had not been ready, or the manufacturing had not been equal to the concept. Dunlop knew nothing of Thomson's earlier work when he sat in that Belfast yard attaching rubber to wheels. He was simply a man solving a problem, with no particular knowledge that the solution would escape his hands within a few years and run so far ahead of him that he could only watch it go. The man who saw what Dunlop had actually invented, who understood it commercially and strategically in a way that its creator either could not or did not, was a Dublin businessman named Harvey de Croce. Where Dunlop saw a practical improvement to his son's afternoon, de Croce saw the future of wheeled transport. In November of 1889, the pneumatic Tyre and Booth's cycle agency was established, beginning the long process of converting a workshop experiment into a commercial enterprise of global scale. John Boyd Dunlop would not remain central to that enterprise for long. The invention outlasted his involvement by more than a century. It happens that way sometimes. A man solves a small problem for someone he loves, and the solution runs beyond him into history, carrying his name but not his hand. By the early years of the 20th century, the company bearing Dunlop's name had settled in Birmingham. The Midlands already understood what it meant to have a works employing thousands, shaping the rhythms of entire streets and neighborhoods. The Dunlop Rubber Company Limited was incorporated in 1901. Birmingham was a city ready for what Dunlop needed. It would give Fort Dunlop its people for the better part of a century, but it was not Birmingham that built the fort. It was the war. In 1914, Britain went to war, and the war needed rubber, not in the quantities that peacetime commerce required, but in volumes that peacetime commerce had never imagined. The Western Front ran on tires. Staff cars carried officers between command posts along roads that artillery had turned into something resembling the surface of the moon. Lorries moved ammunition and rations and the endless material requirements of industrial warfare through mud that would have swallowed an unshod wheel entirely. Motorcycles threaded messages through lines where field telephone cables had not yet arrived. Every one of those vehicles needed tires, and the tires wore out and needed replacing, and the replacements wore out in turn. Rubber, that strange elastic material that the 19th century had pulled from the forests of South America and then learned to cultivate across the tropical plantations of the British Empire, had become as essential to the prosecution of modern warfare as steel or coal, or the ability to keep young men willing to advance across open ground. The demand was structural. It could not be met by wishful thinking or improvised solutions. It required industrial commitment of a kind that did not yet exist in adequate form. Dunlop looked at what the war required and made a decision. What rose between 1915 and 1917 on a site in Erdington at the northern edge of Birmingham was not simply a larger factory. It was a statement, a declaration, made in red brick and structural steel that what happened here was serious and permanent and built for duration. The architects Sidney Stott and W. Gibbings designed the central stores and offices building around a floor plate nearly 52 meters deep. Natural light reached the building's edges but surrendered before it reached the middle. This was not an oversight. It was a consequence of the logic that had driven every decision about the structure. The building was designed for industry, not for comfort. It was a machine for storing and distributing at a scale that required a particular kind of enclosed vastness, and the architects had delivered exactly that. They named it Fort Dunlop. The name was more accurate than it might have appeared. Standing at what would become the M6 corridor, the central building presented to the road an elevation that read less like a commercial property and more like a fortification, a long red brick face, stories high, with a tower carrying the company name above it, the proportions of something built to endure, built to be visible from a distance, built to communicate without ambiguity that the enterprise behind it was not temporary. It had the quality of permanence that only certain kinds of buildings achieve, the quality that makes them feel not merely constructed but established, as though they had always been there and would remain long after the reasons for their construction had been forgotten. And the central building was only part of it. The wider site spread across ground that included multiple specialized factories and facilities, each dedicated to different stages of the process of converting raw rubber into finished tires. Production buildings, stores, Workshops, canteen facilities scaled to feed thousands across multiple shift patterns, rail connections, and sidings, because a works operating at this volume did not receive its materials by road alone. It had its own direct interface with the national rail network, its own capillary connection to the industrial circulatory system of the country. The River Tame ran along the site's edge, marking the boundary between the complex and the surrounding landscape. Internal roads connected the various parts of the fort. Gatehouses controlled the movement of people and materials in and out, with the kind of systematic attention that a military installation would have recognized. To stand at those gatehouses in the 1920s, or the 1930s, or the 1950s was to understand that you were entering something considerably more than a workplace. It was closer to a town, a self-contained world with its own geography, its own rhythms, its own social structures, its own particular understanding of what work meant and who it was for. The people of Erdington and the surrounding streets didn't merely commute to Fort Dunlop. They were, in a sense, organized around it, the way medieval communities had been organized around a cathedral or a castle. The fort was the dominant fact of the landscape, economic, physical, psychological. The raw material that fed all of this came from the other end of the world. Between the wars, Malaya provided roughly half of the global supply of natural rubber. The plantations that produced it were dominated by British-owned estates, companies holding enormous acreages in tropical conditions precisely suited to the cultivation of rubber trees. Dunlop understood early that dependence on a raw material meant vulnerability unless you controlled its supply. By 1926, Dunlop held the largest rubber plantation acreage under single ownership anywhere in the British Empire. The supply chain ran from the plantation to the port to the British coast to the fort's gates, where bales of raw natural rubber arrived with an earthy, faintly organic smell, nothing like the finished product, and left weeks later as tires destined for lorries and buses and family cars on roads that were filling up faster than anyone had predicted. The transformation between those two states, between raw bale and finished tire, was the work of thousands of hands and hundreds of machines and dozens of specialized processes operating simultaneously on a site that at its height never fully stopped. This was not a place that closed at 5 and reopened at 8. This was a place that kept running through the night because there was always more to produce and the demand did not observe office hours. Imagine arriving for the morning shift in 1968. You have walked from the terraced streets of Erdington or cycled or come in on a bus running on Dunlop tires, though that particular irony almost certainly does not occur to you on a cold Birmingham morning with your collar up and your mind on the day ahead. You pass through the gatehouse onto the internal roads of a site so large that the far buildings are a genuine walk away, visible but not close, the distances between departments measured in minutes rather than steps. Ahead of you, the day shift is assembling. Thousands of people arriving through the same gates with the same choreography, a routine worn smooth by repetition into something almost automatic, the particular rhythm of a works that has been doing this for 50 years and knows its own steps without thinking about them. The first thing that reaches you, before you have crossed the threshold of any building, is the smell. Carbon black is a fine material, blended into rubber compounds to give them strength and durability, and it gets into everything with a thoroughness that feels almost intentional. It settles on every surface. It finds its way under fingernails and into the weave of work clothing and into the air of every space where mixing happens. Workers who spent years in the mixing department describe it not as grime in the general sense, but as a specific substance with its own particular quality, a blackness that required a proper shower to shift at the end of a shift, not a rinse, but a genuine effort. Dunlop provided the showers, a company that understood the nature of its own processes well enough to build a proving ground and a laboratory, understood well enough to provide somewhere for its workers to clean themselves before going home. Beneath the carbon black was the rubber itself. Natural rubber carried an earthy, organic smell, almost agricultural, something that connected the factory floor back across thousands of miles to the Malaysian plantation where the raw material had been tapped from the bark of a tree. Synthetic rubber smelled different, sharper, and more chemical, a note that spoke of laboratory formulation rather than cultivation. Then there were the solvents used in the adhesive processes, described by those who worked with them as reminiscent of petrol, not unpleasant exactly, but insistent, the kind of smell that lodges in the memory with such precision that decades later, in a completely different life, you can find yourself back on the floor of Fort Dunlop for a moment, simply because something passing on the street has carried the same note. The mill, which is to say the rubber mixing department, was the loudest and most physically intense part of the entire operation. Enormous mixing mills processed rubber compounds into the precise formulations required for different tire types, different applications, different performance demands. The trapped air releasing from rubber under the pressure of the mills produced a sound that workers described with a specificity that suggests it was genuinely unforgettable. Snap, crackle, pop. Not a whimsical description, but a viscerally accurate one. That sound cut through the general mechanical roar of the department, through the hiss of compressed air lines that always leaked slightly, that being the nature of compressed air systems, and through the underlying rhythmic percussion of the site's continuous production. You learned to hear it as a normal part of the acoustic environment. Former workers recall it the way people recall the sound of a place they have spent years inside, with the involuntary precision of something that has been absorbed rather than memorized. In the tire building departments, the work was different in character. Where the mill was noise and physical force, tire building was precision and trained movement. A journalist from a motorsport publication who visited the fort in 1957 and watched the tire builders at work found himself struggling to capture in straightforward language what he was seeing. The movements were practiced to a degree that made them look effortless. They were not effortless. They were the product of months of training compressed into the body until the skill became physical rather than conscious, the kind of intelligence that industrial work develops in hands and arms, and the particular angle of a wrist that knows by feel whether the material it is working with is correctly aligned. The word he reached for was balletic. Decades later, a former worker who had spent years on the tire building floor and who had never read the 1957 article independently reached for the same word. Like ballet dancers, the movements were precise and repetitive and beautiful in the way that mastery of a difficult physical skill is always beautiful, even when the context is an industrial floor under fluorescent light at 6 in the morning. The buildings ran on shift patterns. At peak production, Fort Dunlop operated 3 shifts, the same spaces and the same machines populated by different groups of people at intervals around the clock, 7 days a week. This was not occasional practice or emergency measure. It was the permanent and steady rhythm of a works with industrial demand to meet and the infrastructure to meet it, on the single condition that it never fully stopped. The site had been designed for this. The buildings had been built for this. The gatehouses had been built for this, for the management of a continuous human tide moving in and out across the clock's full rotation. Feeding this rhythm was a logistics operation that deserves its own moment of attention. A fleet of repurposed vehicles moved food trolleys to the production departments across the fort's internal road network, the distances between the various buildings being too great for workers to reach a central canteen and return within the limits of a break. Women managed much of this catering infrastructure, navigating the site's internal geography with trolleys serving departments that without this arrangement would have had to choose between eating and getting back to their machines on time. The canteen facility itself was a substantial operation, a full-scale institutional kitchen serving thousands across multiple shift patterns with food that was plain by any refined standard, but that represented, in the middle of a physical working day, something more than nutrition. It represented an employer who had arranged the logistics of feeding its workforce as a matter of operational necessity and had not left the arrangement to chance. On site, there was a laundry for work clothing saturated with carbon black. There were instrument repair facilities. Typewriter repair services maintained the equipment of the administrative departments that processed the paperwork required to run an enterprise of this scale. Laboratories carried out testing and quality assurance. Internal transport systems moved raw materials and finished goods between departments and buildings. The fort was not a factory that depended on the town around it for these things. It had arranged to provide them for itself, turning the site into something closer to a self-sufficient organism than a conventional workplace, a place that generated most of what its own functioning required without needing to reach beyond its own fences. For the workers who came through those gatehouses every morning from the surrounding streets of Erdington, Fort Dunlop represented something that employment alone cannot fully account for. Security is the word that comes closest, but security in a sense that goes deeper than the wage packet and the pension. The security of a place so vast, so embedded in the fabric of the city around it, so apparently necessary to the functioning of everything that ran on wheels, that its continued existence seemed less like a possibility and more like a geological fact. Things that have been there for 50 years, that have survived 2 world wars and a depression, that employ 10,000 people and draw their raw material from the other end of the world and put their name on the tires of racing cars competing at the highest levels of European motorsport, do not simply stop. The mind does not easily construct the scenario in which they stop. The fort seemed permanent in the way that the River Tame along its edge seemed permanent, in the way that the surrounding streets seemed permanent. It was simply there, and it was going to keep being there, and that certainty organized a great deal of what the people living around it understood about their own futures. Many families had multiple members on the payroll, fathers and sons, brothers, wives and husbands, cousins. The social fabric of the fort was woven through the surrounding community in ways that no employment statistic captures adequately. A young man starting on the floor in the early 1960s might find himself working alongside someone whose father had worked alongside his own father in the same department. This was not unusual. This was, for many, the expected shape of a working life, the natural continuation of a pattern that the previous generation had established and that the generation after would presumably continue. The fort offered not only employment, but a kind of social location, a place within the world that came with a community already attached, with relationships and solidarities, and the particular understanding that develops between people who spend their working hours in the same loud, physically demanding space. The hierarchy was as unmistakably British as the building itself, staff and shop floor, suits and overalls. The social geography of a large British works in the 1960s was not subtle in its distinctions, and nobody who worked inside it was in any doubt about which side of those distinctions they occupied. Different dining arrangements, different entrances, different physical spaces assigned to different grades of employment, the small but precisely calibrated architecture of class that organized British industrial life in ways that were entirely taken for granted by the people living inside them. Multiple trade unions represented different categories of workers, each with their own shop stewards, each with their own particular relationship with management, each with their own history of agreements and disputes, and the accumulated institutional memory of previous negotiations. The complexity of that union landscape was not a simple story. It was a web of competing interests and solidarities, and occasional tensions between workers whose immediate concerns did not always align, reflecting the genuine complexity of 10,000 people doing dozens of different kinds of work under the same roof and the same name. But within the shop floor itself, the camaraderie was specific and real. People who spend 8 hours together in conditions of noise and physical effort, and the kind of mutual dependence that comes from working as part of a continuous process, develop relationships that are forged differently from those formed in quieter circumstances. The particular humor of the floor, the unwritten codes governing who can take a joke and who cannot, who is the character of the department, who you want next to you when something goes wrong, the easy solidarity of shared difficulty, of people who understand without explanation what the other person's working day feels like because they are living the same one. Fort Dunlop was not only a place of production, it was a place of genuine engineering ambition, and the distinction matters more than it might initially appear. The proving ground that occupied open land adjacent to the main site was not a marketing exercise or a concession to motorsport enthusiasm. It was the infrastructure of confidence, the physical embodiment of a belief that quality was something you tested into existence through method and rigor rather than assumed through tradition or reputation. The facility itself was remarkable in its specificity. There was a banked section 800 feet in length with a transverse bank of 1 in 5, a slope that generated constant lateral force, simulating the cornering loads a tire would encounter in real use without the variability that real roads introduced. There was a skid pad 400 feet by 150, approached by a 1,300-foot run-up road, where tires were assessed under controlled braking and cornering conditions that could be repeated exactly because repeatability was the precondition of measurement. There were surfaces of different materials, smooth asphalt, granite sets, sea-polished pebbles, each chosen because it failed tires in a different way and for a different reason, and a company claiming genuine understanding of the physics of grip needed to test against all of them. Inside specialized test houses, high-speed rigs operated under instrumentation that measured forces and deformations and temperatures with a precision that the road could not provide. Visitors to the site in 1957 could watch through observation windows as tires were pushed beyond ordinary operating conditions into the territory of failure, because the engineers understood something that the sales department perhaps preferred not to advertise quite so prominently: that understanding how a tire fails is the only reliable way to engineer one that does not. The men who worked on the proving ground were doing science. They were not performing for visitors or generating promotional material. They were accumulating the specific knowledge of what rubber compounds and construction geometries actually did under loads and speeds and temperatures that a tire in service would encounter, and they were using that knowledge to make the next generation of tires better than the one before it. The most demanding application of that knowledge was motorsport. By the 1950s and into the 60s, Dunlop supplied tires to teams competing at the highest level of Formula One. The cars that raced across the circuits of Europe carried, in the compounds and constructions of their tires, the accumulated engineering knowledge of the proving ground. Racing records from the era confirmed Dunlop's prominence among the major suppliers, its name present across a significant portion of the competitive field. Within the wider Fort complex, a dedicated facility produced the specialist tires that went on to racing cars, operating on a production schedule that reflected the demands of a sport that did not observe weekends in the way that ordinary commerce did. The construction of a high-performance racing tire involved stages that were remarkable even by the standards of the main production facility. Banbury mixers blended rubber compounds to specifications of a precision that left no margin for approximation. Layers of different materials, rubber, fabric, steel cord, were assembled by hand in specific sequence by workers whose skill had been trained into their bodies over years of practice. Then came vulcanization, the application of heat and pressure somewhere around 200 degrees Celsius and 10 bar, sustained for roughly 20 minutes, during which the raw rubber underwent a chemical transformation into something capable of surviving the demands a Formula One car placed on it at racing speed. Heat, pressure, time, chemistry. The room where this happened stayed warm in ways that the Birmingham winter could not overcome, and the smell of rubber curing under heat, dense and chemical, and unlike anything else, was continuous across every shift. The workers who built those tires understood the stakes of their work in a way that workers producing tires for family saloons did not need to in quite the same way. A tire destined for a racing car carried the life of its driver in its construction. The hands that built it were the last point of human agency before it went onto a vehicle that would be pushed to the absolute limit of its capabilities. The workers in that department knew this. It was part of what made the work matter. It was part of what made Fort Dunlop, at the height of its powers in the mid-1950s, something considerably more than a large factory in the north of Birmingham. By 1954, Fort Dunlop stood at the summit of what it would ever be. 10,000 workers, a proving ground that embodied engineering seriousness in physical form. Motorsport contracts that placed the fort's product at the center of the most technically demanding competition in the world. Supply chains stretching to the Malayan Peninsula and drawing on decades of accumulated rubber knowledge. The word that motorsport journalists used when they visited the site in 1957 was empire, and for once, it was not a journalist's exaggeration. It was the accurate description of something that had grown from a Belfast yard and a child's tricycle into an industrial entity of genuine global reach, anchored in a single red brick building beside what would become one of Britain's busiest motorways. The market that fed this empire seemed, from inside it, to have no ceiling. British car production in the 1950s was growing at a pace that felt less like a cycle and more like the establishment of a permanent new order. Roads were filling. The motor industry was expanding at a rate that turned what had been a middle-class luxury into a working-class possibility in the course of a single decade. Every car needed 4 tires. Every set of tires wore out. Every owner who replaced them reached for the brand that had been fitted at the factory, or the brand whose name they already knew from the side of a lorry or the coverage of a race. Dunlop was one of those names. Its position in the market felt as solid as the proving ground's banked sections. Earned, tested, and built to last. The Fort's self-understanding was of a company that had justified its position through genuine quality, through method rather than assumption, through the accumulated expertise of half a century of making tires in Birmingham and testing them to their limits on ground adjacent to where they were built. This was not unfounded. The motorsport record was real. The testing infrastructure was real. The reputation rested on something substantial, and yet, looking back from a distance that was not available to anyone standing inside it at the time, the summit was already shadowed by complications that the view from the top made difficult to see. Even in 1925, a reporter from the Times covering a labor dispute at the fort had noted almost in passing that tire imports had risen sharply in the first half of that year compared with the year before. The efficiency changes that triggered the dispute, modifications to the mixing mills designed to reduce time and cost, were a management response to pressures that were already forming. Competition from abroad, cost pressures at home, the perpetual industrial tension between what workers needed from a job and what accountants needed from a process. These were not inventions of the 1970s or the failures of a later generation. They were patterns as old as industrial capitalism itself, present at the fort from its early decades. running beneath the surface of its prosperity like a current beneath apparently still water. In 1925, 30 years before the peak, the forces that would eventually unravel Fort Dunlop were not gathering on the horizon. They were already in the room. The management understood this in 1925. Whether they understood in 1954 how serious those forces would eventually become is a different question, and the honest answer is probably that nobody could have seen it from where they stood. The summit looked permanent. The fort was enormous, and its name was on the sides of lorries from one end of Britain to the other, and 10,000 people walked through its gatehouses every morning, and the machines ran on through the night. They were at the top. They simply did not know that the top was where they were. Change, when it comes to a place like Fort Dunlop, does not arrive as a single event with a clear date and an identifiable cause. It arrives the way weather arrives across flat ground, slowly at first, and then all at once. First, a shift in the light, a cooling in the air, the kind of alteration you register without naming, because naming it would require admitting something you are not yet prepared to admit. Then, before you have finished reassuring yourself that it is nothing, the sky has changed entirely, and the thing you were not prepared to admit has become the thing you are living inside. The first changes were technological, and technology is a particularly difficult kind of change to argue against because it presents itself not as threat but as progress. Inner tube production had been a significant part of the fort's output for decades. Through the late 1950s and into the 60s, tubeless tires became the industry standard, building the airtight seal into the tire and wheel rim assembly and eliminating the inner tube as a separate component. Entire departments at the fort had been built around inner tube manufacture. Those departments did not vanish overnight, but the direction of travel was clear to anyone willing to look at it directly, and the direction pointed away from what those spaces had been built to do. The shift to radial tire construction was more fundamental still, and its consequences ran deeper than the inner tube's obsolescence. The difference between a cross-ply tire and a radial is not obvious to someone who has never examined a tire's internal structure, but it is enormously consequential. Radial tires run cooler, they last longer, they handle better at higher speeds, which was becoming increasingly relevant as the roads of post-war Britain began to fill with cars capable of sustaining velocities that the road network of a decade earlier had not been designed to accommodate. Michelin, the French manufacturer, had pioneered radial construction and was selling into the British market with a product that former fort workers described in retrospect as genuinely superior for the conditions that post-war motoring had created. Once the major car manufacturers understood what radial construction offered, once the quality differential became impossible to ignore, the market moved. The question of how to respond to radial technology was one that Dunlop's management wrestled with across years that were not forgiving of indecision. Which direction to commit to, how much capital to invest, where to build new capability and on what timescale. These were not easy questions in any era, and they were being asked during a period when the broader economics of British manufacturing were already beginning to shift in ways that made large capital commitments feel dangerous rather than necessary. As one former engineer recalled it years later, the choices made about radial technology and the timing of those choices were among the factors that shaped what came next. It was framed, as such decisions always are at the moment of making them, as strategic prudence. Looking back from the distance of decades, it reads more like a hesitation at precisely the moment when hesitation was most expensive. Then, in 1970, came a signal that those who were paying attention could not easily dismiss. Dunlop withdrew from Formula One and Formula Two. The motorsport press described the decision as startling, a word that captures how completely unanticipated it was by the people who had simply assumed Dunlop's presence at the top of motor racing as part of the natural order of the sport. For decades, the connection between the fort's engineering ambitions and the proving ground of international motorsport had been one of the things that distinguished Dunlop from a company that merely made tires at volume. Motorsport had been the place where the fort's engineering knowledge was most publicly tested and most visibly validated. The withdrawal from it was not merely a commercial decision about the allocation of resources. It was the first visible sign of a company contracting, pulling back from the edges of its ambitions toward what seemed more defensible, making decisions that felt reasonable in their immediate context and would look, with the distance of years, like the opening movement of a very long retreat. The 1970s arrived at Fort Dunlop the way they arrived at most of British manufacturing, not as a single catastrophe, but as a sustained accumulation of pressures that combined into something no individual element of them had quite prepared anyone for. The oil crisis of 1973 remade the economics of transport and manufacturing simultaneously. Inflation was eroding the purchasing power of wages, while the cost of production climbed. The broader industrial settlement that had held since the end of the war, the implicit agreement between employers and workers and government about what the economy was for and who it served, was beginning to fracture in ways that were visible and painful, and that nobody involved in the fracturing had chosen as an outcome. Fort Dunlop was not insulated from any of this. It was inside it, subject to the same pressures, the same cost increases, the same deteriorating relationship between what things cost to make and what the market would pay for them. But perhaps the most consequential force gathering around the fort during these years was corporate rather than economic in its immediate nature. The question of who owned Dunlop and what the people who owned it intended to do with it was becoming increasingly central to everything that would follow. In 1967, the company had changed its name to Dunlop Limited. It was presented as a rationalization, a tidying up of nomenclature to reflect the breadth of what the company had become. But it arrived at a moment when the wider corporate landscape was shifting beneath the company's feet in ways that made the name change feel, in retrospect, like the redecorating of a building whose foundations were already under examination. Consolidation was the governing logic of the era. Companies joining together to create entities large enough to compete globally, to achieve the economies of scale that individual national markets could no longer guarantee against competitors operating from the larger base of the American domestic market or the combined strength of continental Europe. The fort had been built on a national market. British cars needing British tires, British roads filling with British-made vehicles that needed the product that 10,000 people in Erdington produced. That market, as Britain's relationship with international trade deepened and the protections that had insulated domestic manufacturing from global competition were progressively reduced, was no longer the enclosed and reliable thing it had once been. In 1971, Dunlop and the Italian manufacturer Pirelli merged their operations. The announcement was not framed as a defensive maneuver. It was presented as strength, as the creation of something larger and more capable than either company could be alone, a European answer to the American giants whose scale gave them advantages in cost and distribution that no single national manufacturer could match independently. Goodyear and Firestone had the depth of the American domestic market behind them and were pushing into Europe with a force that individual national tire companies found increasingly difficult to counter. The logic of the Dunlop-Pirelli alliance was not irrational. Two established European manufacturers combining their resources, their technology, their manufacturing footprint, and their accumulated engineering knowledge to create something capable of competing on the terms that the global market was beginning to demand. In 1971, that argument had genuine force. The merger lasted roughly a decade. By 1981, it was dissolved. The alliance that had promised strength had not delivered what either party had sought from it. The specific anatomy of its failure involves the kind of detail that belongs in a business school case study rather than a reckoning with what happened to 10,000 jobs in North Birmingham. Cultural friction between organizations formed in different countries, speaking different languages, operating under different industrial traditions. Strategic disagreements about direction and investment and the allocation of shared resources. The fundamental difficulty of integrating manufacturing operations across national boundaries in an industry where the competitive pressures that had driven the merger in the first place had not eased during the years the merger took to fail. What matters for this story is simpler than any of that. Dunlop entered the alliance seeking strength. It emerged from the alliance without having found it. The decade that the merger consumed was a decade in which the global tire industry continued to consolidate and evolve, and Dunlop spent much of it managing an internal complexity that left less capacity for the strategic decisions that the external environment demanded. And then, in the early years of the 1980s, came the decision that would prove irreversible. Dunlop's European tire operations were sold to Sumitomo Rubber Industries of Japan. The precise year is recorded differently in different sources, some placing it in 1982, others in 1983. The year matters less than the fact. A British tire company, built over 8 decades from a Belfast yard and a Birmingham factory into an enterprise of global reach, sold the heart of its European manufacturing business to a Japanese competitor. Not because anyone in the transaction harbored any particular hostility toward the people of Erdington or the institution they had built their working lives around. Not because anyone sat in a boardroom and made the calculation that 10,000 Midlands workers were expendable as human beings, but because the logic of the balance sheet had arrived at a conclusion, and the logic of place and community and what a works meant to the streets that had organized themselves around it for 60 years had no established mechanism for entering the room where that conclusion was being reached. Sumitomo saw in Dunlop's European tire operations something worth acquiring. The value was real. It was measured in assets and market positions and manufacturing knowledge and the kind of brand recognition that takes decades to build and cannot be created from scratch at any price. Someone on Dunlop's side made the calculation that those assets were worth more as the subject of a transaction than as the foundation of a continued independent strategy. Someone agreed to terms. The ownership of the enterprise on which the surrounding streets had been organized since before the First World War changed hands, in the language of corporate finance, in liabilities and valuations and transfer agreements, in a language that contained no word for what the fort had been to the people who had built it. In 1985, the remainder of Dunlop Holdings was acquired by BTR. BTR was a conglomerate, a company that held a portfolio of industrial businesses and managed them according to the logic that portfolio management applies to such things, which is a fundamentally different logic from the one that manufacturers apply to manufacturing. The distinction is not technical or obscure. A manufacturer asks what can be done to make better products more efficiently and strengthen the company's position in its market. A portfolio manager asks what a given asset returns and whether that return is sufficient relative to what else might be done with the same capital. These are not the same question. They lead to different answers. They produce different decisions, and over time, accumulated decisions based on different answers to different questions produce different outcomes. The fort by the mid-1980s had already seen most of its main production wind down. The great era of mass tire manufacture at Erdington was, for practical purposes, finished before the decade was out. What remained was specialist production, specifically the motorsport and motorcycle tire facility that had been part of the fort's identity since its earliest racing connections, which now represented not the summit of an industrial empire, but the last functioning remnant of one. 241 people. That is the number worth holding on to as the story moves into its final decades. Not 10,000, not the army of workers that had filled the gatehouses across 3 shifts around the clock at the height of the fort's powers, but 241. The distance between those two numbers is itself a history, a compressed account of everything that had happened to British tire manufacturing between 1954 and the years when the last specialist facility was still operating. Each one of those 241 workers represented a skill that had been developed over years, a particular knowledge of what rubber compounds did under heat and pressure, and the specific demands of motorsport competition. They were among the last people in Britain doing work that the fort had once employed 10,000 to do. The reduction was so complete that it was difficult, standing inside it, to see it as reduction at all. It had become simply the shape of things, the new normal of a facility that had contracted so far from its original dimensions that the contraction itself was no longer visible as contraction. It was just the size the place was now. The motorsport tire business that sustained those 241 jobs was not trivial. It was technically demanding in ways that mass production of passenger car tires had never been required to be. The tires that left this facility went onto racing cars competing in major series, onto motorcycles ridden at speeds where the margin between a tire performing correctly and a tire failing was the margin between a race result and a catastrophe. The construction knowledge required, the compound science, the understanding of what vulcanization under precisely controlled conditions of heat and pressure and time actually produced in the behavior of a tire at racing speed, was the accumulated inheritance of everything the fort had been. It was the distilled remainder of 50 years of proving ground methodology and laboratory testing and the particular expertise that develops only in organizations that have been doing the same difficult thing for long enough to have made every possible mistake and learned from each one. A published account of the facility from 2013, written while it was still operational, describes a 24-hour production schedule. This should surprise nobody who understands what motorsport demands of its suppliers. Racing calendars do not accommodate the preferences of production planners. A race weekend arrives on the date it was always going to arrive on, and the tires required for it need to be ready regardless of what else is happening in the world. The workers on that floor understood this. It was part of the particular pressure and particular pride of the work. The knowledge that what they were building was going to be used under conditions where every element of its construction would be tested to its absolute limit in front of the largest audiences in world motorsport. The Banbury mixers that blended the rubber compounds operated to specifications that left no meaningful margin for approximation. The hand assembly stages required workers whose fingers knew, by feel developed over years, whether the materials they were working with were correctly positioned and correctly tensioned before the whole assembly went into the vulcanizing press. The press itself was not a forgiving machine. It applied its heat and pressure and held them for the prescribed duration, and what came out of it was either right or it was not, and whether it was right or not was in large part a function of whether the hands that had built it before it went in had done their work correctly. There was no stage after vulcanization at which a fundamental error in construction could be corrected. The process was irreversible. The workers knew this. It was baked into how they approached the work, the particular focused attention of people who understand that what they are doing cannot be undone. Meanwhile, the building that had once housed the central nervous system of all this activity stood largely quiet along the M6. The central stores and offices structure, The building that the architects had designed in the 1920s with its 52-meter floor plate and its tower carrying the company name had spent much of the 1980s and 90s in various states of partial use and gradual abandonment. At one point in its long decline from industrial purpose, the building's vast exterior elevation had been used to support an advertising hoarding for a Ford Mondeo, visible for more than a mile along the motorway approach, one of Britain's most significant industrial structures, built to declare the seriousness of an enterprise employing 10,000 people, reduced to a billboard for a family car. The works hooter that had marked the shift changes and organized the rhythms of the surrounding streets for 7 decades had long since fallen silent, not because of any single decision, because of 1,000 decisions, each of them made under pressure and in good faith and in response to conditions that were real, accumulating step by step into a silence that nobody standing at the beginning of that chain had chosen as the destination. In 1999, the regeneration company Urban Splash acquired the central building. What followed was a 7-year conversion project that cost £45 million and transformed the derelict warehouse into what its owners described as a vertical office park. The architects at Shed KM faced a challenge that was partly structural and partly philosophical. The building's extraordinary depth, that 52-meter floor plate designed for industrial logic rather than human comfort, admitted natural light only at its edges and surrendered to darkness long before reaching the middle. This had been acceptable, even appropriate, when the building's purpose was the storage and distribution of tire production at industrial scale. It was considerably less acceptable for the marketing agencies and consultancies that would constitute the building's new commercial population. The conversion had to contend with this fundamental tension between what the building had been designed to do and what it was now being asked to do, between the industrial logic that had produced its extraordinary proportions and the commercial requirements of the service economy that would inhabit them. The result preserved the fort's exterior with a fidelity that its industrial inheritance deserved. The long red brick elevation, the tower, the scale that made everything around it look provisional, all of it remained. Inside, the space was reorganized for purposes that had nothing to do with rubber or carbon black or the heat and chemistry of vulcanization. Meeting rooms replaced production floors. Glass-walled offices occupied spaces that had once held machinery. A hotel extension added accommodation in a contemporary architectural language that sat beside the original structure without pretending to be part of it. Fort Dunlop reopened in 2006, commercially viable, architecturally intact, and populated by businesses whose relationship to the activity that had built the building was one of pure historical coincidence. The question of what it means to save a building while removing everything that the building was built to contain is one that regeneration projects almost never ask directly. The preservation is real. The £45 million was real. The tenants are real businesses employing real people doing genuine work. None of this is in dispute. But the distance between saving a building and preserving what the building was for is a distance that the language of regeneration tends to collapse, treating the shell as though it were the substance, the container, as though it were equivalent to what it once contained. Fort Dunlop, the building was saved. Fort Dunlop, the enterprise, the 10,000 workers, the proving ground, the racing tires built on a 24-hour schedule, the carbon black in the air, and the smell of curing rubber, and the snap and crackle of the mixing mills, that Fort Dunlop was not saved. It was not savable by any intervention available in 1999 or 2006. It had already been gone for years by the time Urban Splash arrived with £45 million and a set of architectural drawings. In February of 2014, Dunlop Motorsport Europe announced the closure of the Birmingham plant, 241 jobs, production to transfer to existing continental facilities, car tire production to Hanau in Germany, motorcycle tire production to Montluçon in France. The announcement was made. The processes began. Parliamentary debate touched on the surrounding circumstances, the involvement of adjacent land in Jaguar Land Rover's expansion, the efforts to identify an alternative Birmingham site, the particular geography of industrial decision-making in which a factory's fate can be altered by what its neighbors decide to do with their own ground. None of it changed the outcome. At the end of May 2014, tire manufacture in Birmingham ended. It is worth sitting with that sentence. Not paused, not relocated, ended. The last tire built in the city that had been making tires since the first decade of the 20th century was built in May 2014, and the machines that built it were shut down, and the workers cleared their lockers and walked out. 241 people, not 10,000, which is itself the measure of how much had already been lost before this final loss arrived. The building still stands beside the M6, still enormous, still legible from the motorway as something that was built to matter. The red brick hasn't faded, the tower still carries the name, but the carbon black is gone from the air. The smell of curing rubber has been gone for decades. The mixing mills are silent. The proving ground is a retail park. The vulcanizing rooms are meeting spaces with whiteboards and glass walls, and the faint anxiety of places where people present things to other people in the hope of impressing them. What remains is the building, and inside the building, the silence where the work used to be.